but not next Wednesday then. Well, let's go on with Matthew chapter 21. We got as far as verse 27 last week, but I'm going to begin again with verses 23 to 27. Just touch on them briefly because they set the context for what follows. So a brief reminder of what we saw in verses 23 to 27, and then we'll go on with the rest of the chapter. And when Jesus entered the temple, Matthew 21:23, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" These things probably refers primarily to what he had just done in the temple and throwing out the money changers and overturning the tables and so on. Who gave you the right to do this kind of thing? They're asking him. Well, Jesus doesn't answer directly. He answers them, "I will also ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I'll also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man? Was John a prophet from God, or was this his own idea only?" Behind that question lies the truth that though Jesus has an entirely different degree of authority than John, the source is the same. And if they're not prepared to recognize that in John's case, there's no sense dealing with it or raising it, making an issue of it in Jesus' case either. And we notice from what follows that their interest wasn't in the truth of that question whatsoever. They discussed among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, we're afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet." Okay, not even considering the question whether John was from God or from man, just looking at how are they going to appear in the eyes of people if they say A or if they say B. And because it's going to be bad either way, they decide they'll just say they don't know, not treating the question seriously at all. And because they don't treat the question seriously when Jesus puts it to them, he's not going to answer that question either. If they said, "We don't know," he says, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Having said that, we're going to look at the next two parables in this chapter, and Jesus answers the question very clearly in these two parables for those with eyes to see. And it's clear that the chief priests and the Pharisees did get the point, and we'll see their response to it. So first of all, the parable of the two sons, Matthew 21, verse 28. What do you think? And this is clearly a sequel to what's just happened. The chief priests and the scribes, the elders of the people, refusing to acknowledge John the Baptist's authority, therefore not recognizing Jesus' authority either. So Jesus addresses that issue through this parable. What do you think? A man had two sons, and he went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." And he answered, "I will not." But afterwards changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same. And he answered, "I go, sir." Now let me pause there just for a minute. This word "sir" is a very tricky one. It is the word kurios in Greek, and that means Lord. Now, it has a wide range of meanings, and it could mean sir. And in the context of a parable, the translator thinks that's the most appropriate translation for it. The son says to his father, "Sir," I don't know if that's the way you usually address your father, but he says, "Kuria, sir." In John chapter 12, some Greeks come to Peter first and then to Andrew, right? "Sir," we would see Jesus, and it's the same word. So "sir" is an appropriate translation in certain contexts. But in other contexts, it means master of a slave or simply Lord. And when we get Lord in the Old Testament, the Greek translation has this same word. And that's significant here because it is those who speak of the Father as Lord who don't actually do his will. We'll draw that out in a minute, but just point that out for the moment. The son says, "I go, Lord, I go, sir, but did not go. So which of the two did the will of his father? They said, the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness. Here's his answer to the question, who gave John his authority? He came in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterwards change your minds and believe him. All right, when Jesus tells a parable, I think most frequently he tells the parable and leaves it to his hearers to figure out the point of what he's saying. And some get it, and for others it's water off a duck's back, and they don't even think about it any further. And in fact, that seems to be the reason, that's one of the reasons why Jesus spoke in parables. It will give more insight to those who have insight and to those who are interested in finding out more. To those who aren't interested, to those who have no insight, it's just water off their back. So Jesus sometimes simply tells a parable without giving any explanation. Other times he tells a parable to the crowd and explains it to his disciples. This time, he tells the parable and then explains it for his hearers so that there can be no mistaking. Okay, so the son who says, I'm not going, but then goes and does it, as Jesus explains it, clearly refers to the tax collectors and the prostitutes, whose whole way of life up to this point is a no to God, right? They're living in open sin. It's a no to God. When the father comes and asks the son, go do this, he says no, represents the tax collectors and prostitutes, whose way of life is a no to God. But then they change their mind and go and do what the father asked. Just as these tax collectors and prostitutes, whose way of life is a no to God, responded positively when John the Baptist came on the scene, and of course when Jesus did as well. They changed their mind, they repented, and it's the same word for repented. They were living a life of sin, a no to God. They respond positively to God's messengers, to John, then to Jesus. They change their mind, and they go and do the Father's will. Now, it's interesting that Jesus says this is true of the tax collectors and prostitutes in their response to John, because it's certainly their response to Jesus as well. John the Baptist and Jesus were very different people, and their approach was very different, and that was brought up against them. Remember, Jesus said, John the Baptist comes neither eating or drinking, and you say, he's got a devil. We're not going to listen to him. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, you say he's a glutton and a winebibber, and so on. They don't take either one. But both of them, with their very different approaches, are servants of God, the Son of God, messengers from God. And the tax collectors and the prostitutes responded positively to these very different messengers of God with the same positive response. And then there's the other side. The chief priests and the elders of the people are clearly the son who says yes, because everything about their profession, everything about their way of life is a yes to God. We are God's servants. We're serving him in the temple. We're studying his scriptures and so on. Everything about their way of life is an apparent yes to God. And yet when John the Baptist comes with his message and Jesus comes with his message, it turns out to be a no. So those whose way of life is a no, nonetheless repent the messenger and respond positively to God's messenger. Those whose way of life seems to be a yes to God, when John the Baptist comes or Jesus comes, they respond negatively. And Jesus then draws out the consequence of this in words that we cannot begin to grasp their shocking impact at the time. Piety and long repetition, many repetitions, wears off the shock of this. But Jesus says the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God before God's priests in the temple and the students of his law. Prostitutes, tax collectors, and you don't get any worse than that. They're going into the kingdom of God and you're not, is in effect what he's saying. What conclusions can we draw from this? What lessons can we draw from this? Well, obviously the last shall be first and the first shall be last, as Jesus says frequently. Also, we can't go by words or by appearances, obviously. And may I ask, we cannot go by quote unquote, unquote, decisions either necessarily. Because it's the decision that leads to perseverance that matters, not a decision that's made in an emotional moment or something that doesn't have any consequences later. Now, this is not in the least a critique of those who call for decisions. It is just pointing out that decisions in themselves are not necessary. I mean, you do have to make a decision, and it is appropriate and right to call for a decision. But it's not everyone who, quote unquote, makes a decision who is going to end up in the kingdom of God. It's not words or appearances or initial responses, decisions, quote unquote, but it's whether or not we actually do the will of the Father. Jesus makes the point repeatedly throughout the gospel, and one of the most clear-cut examples of it is in Matthew 7. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus, summing it all up, says, it's not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, who's going to enter the kingdom of God, but those who do the will of my Father. And the will of my Father in this context is obviously all that Jesus has been teaching throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, just as the Son says, Lord, I'm going, and then doesn't do it. No, it's not everyone who says, Lord, Lord. It's not words or appearances that matter, but those who actually do the will of the Father. So don't write people off because of words or appearances. God's chosen ones, God's faithful ones, may be among those who we are tempted to write off because of appearances. And secondly, there's obviously a warning in it to those who profess to be God's people. Is our Christian faith merely a matter of words and appearances? Or is it shown in lives of obedience to the Father's will? It's also interesting, as I pointed out, that people's response to John the Baptist matched their response to Jesus, very different though they were. And it's the same with Jesus' messengers. Those who respond to Jesus' messengers are responding to him, as he makes clear. Those who respond to him respond to them who sent him, and those who respond to those he sent are responding to him as well. All right, let's go on with the next parable. Here another parable, verse 33. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, They will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants, who will give them the fruits in their seasons. Jesus said to them, Have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. All right, when Jesus tells a parable, usually he leaves his listeners to figure it out. Sometimes he explains it to his disciples. In the one we just saw, he explained it to everybody. And sometimes they need no explanation because their meaning is so perfectly obvious. And the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees, were told, got this point very clearly. It was so obvious. So he doesn't need to explain it, though he does draw out its consequences. What's the point of the parable? Well, let's note, first of all, that Jesus is building on an Old Testament parable in particular, but a number of Old Testament passages which speak of God's people as a vineyard. We're not going to look at them tonight, but look at Psalm 80, verses 8 to 16, also Ezekiel chapter 17, or Ezekiel 19, verses 10 to 14, all passages in which this picture of God's people as a vineyard, that picture is developed. But the one passage that is closest to our parable tonight is one that I want us to take a minute to look at, and that's Isaiah chapter 5. Jesus is the primary teller of parables in Scripture, but not the only one. And Isaiah tells a very similar parable in Isaiah chapter 5, and it's very clear that Jesus is picking up on this parable in his own parable in Matthew 21. Isaiah 5, let me sing a song for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it with stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, it shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, an outcry. All right, that's a passage worth looking at in its own right, but let's just notice some of the parallels between Isaiah's parable and Jesus. God's people are the vineyard. And God does everything that should be necessary for that vineyard to produce fruit. Isaiah goes to great length. He dug it, he cleared it of stones, planted it with choice vines, built a watchtower, built a wine vat, and put a hedge around it, and so on. And Jesus makes the same point in his parable. He planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a vineyard, built a tower, and so on. He's clearly echoing Isaiah 5. But the point is, God has done everything that ought to be necessary for his vineyard to bear the fruit that it ought to bear, but it doesn't happen as it should. Now, in Isaiah's case, he stresses the sinfulness of the people as a whole. There's murder, there's outcries for justice instead of the righteousness that God expects of them. In Jesus' parable, the focus is on the leaders of Israel and their responsibility, their misuse of the authority that's been given to them. And the point is, if I can put it this way, they've forgotten the fundamental truth of Matthew 8:9. The curious thing about Matthew 8:9 is this fundamental truth comes on the lips of a centurion, not on the lips of Jesus. But the fundamental truth is this: we are all human beings created by God in his image. No human being has inherently in himself or herself any right to have authority over any other human being. Right? We're all God's creatures. No human being, as God creature, has inherent authority over any other human being. But there are nonetheless those with authority. But those with authority are those who are under authority. That is, those who have authority are those to whom God has given that authority, and they exercise that authority under God's authority. In the story in Matthew chapter 8, the centurion says to Jesus, "I'm not worthy that you come under my roof." And then he puts it in what seems initially a strange way, "because I also am a man under authority and I can tell people what to do." And it sounds backwards. I'm under authority so I can tell people what to do, but that's precisely the point. It's because he is under the authority of Caesar and has Caesar's authority that he can tell people what to do. It's only those who are under authority who have any authority that has been vested in them by God. That's why Romans chapter 13 tells us that rulers have been given authority by God and they're to exercise it under him. It's why parents have authority over children, because God has vested it in them, and so on. Authority, there is such a thing as God-given authority, but those who are given authority have no right to authority inherent in themselves. It is because God has given it to them, and they can only exercise it under God. Well, what has happened here is that these leaders of Israel have been given authority by God to exercise under his authority, and instead they assume it as their own right to do with as they please. They are stewards. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, "Let a man think of us as stewards." We've been entrusted with something and we're responsible for what we do with what's been entrusted to us. Or Matthew chapter 25, a parable we'll see down the road, Lord willing. The master gives his servants talents, different talents, and they're responsible for what they do with the talents that have been entrusted to them. So these chief priests and elders, who are indeed leaders in Israel, because God has given them that authority, have been entrusted with authority to exercise it on his behalf and under his authority, and for the good of those over whom they've been placed. But instead, they take what has been entrusted to them as theirs to do with as they wish. They can refuse to give it back or give up the fruit when its fruit comes. And they can even disregard the authority that's of the one who has given them their authority and the one who has vested in them this trust. So they refuse to recognize the authority of one who gave them their authority. They mistreat his messengers. And in the end, they mistreat his son as well. Obviously, and I say obviously because the chief priests and elders get the point. This one was unmistakable. Obviously, what Jesus is saying is that Israel's leadership is walking in the footsteps of their forefathers who refused to listen to God's messengers, the prophets, and mistreated them. And indeed, they're going to outdo all their forefathers in rejecting God's own Son. That's the first part of the message. The second part is this, that God nonetheless, in spite of the way they treat his Son, God nonetheless is going to vindicate him. He's the stone rejected by men that Psalm 118 speaks of. He's rejected by the leaders of Israel, but nonetheless, God is going to make him into the cornerstone, the one on whom he's going to build the temple of the new people of God, and he's going to reconstitute the people of God under different leadership. Now, it's important to see that Jesus is not saying God has rejected Israel. He is clearly saying, because we know that God hasn't rejected Israel. Paul asked that very question in Romans chapter 11. Has God rejected his people? No. I'm an Israelite myself, and God has his elect, and one day he has a place for Israel as a whole. So the point is not that God has rejected Israel as a people, but he has rejected their leadership, and he's reconstituting the people of God in a way that's going to include Gentiles as well. That's part of the message. But I want us to think for a few minutes of the different passages in the New Testament, quoting Old Testament passages that speak of Christ as a stone. Because there are several passages in the Old Testament that refer to a stone that are quoted in the New Testament and applied to Christ. The one in this particular passage is from Psalm 118. And by the way, Psalm 118 was already referred to earlier in the chapter. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The response to Jesus riding into Jerusalem was a quotation from Psalm 118. So is this, the stone which the builders refused has become the headstone of the corner, or the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Also from Psalm 118, making the point that Christ, rejected by men, is going to become the cornerstone of God's new people. Romans chapter 9, verse 33 speaks of Christ as a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And then he goes on to say, however, whoever believes in him will not be ashamed. Okay? Paul is actually quoting two passages from Isaiah that refer to a stone over which some will stumble, but in which others will place their confidence, and they will not be put to shame. Isaiah 28:16 and Isaiah 8:14. Interestingly, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 to 8, quotes those same two verses that Paul has quoted from Isaiah and adds the verse from Psalm 118 that we get here. So all three of these passages are brought together in order to say again that Jesus Christ is the precious stone for believers. For you who believe is the preciousness. But for those outside, those who reject him, he's the stone of the builders who reject it and who refuse to believe. They stumble over it. And then there's one more passage quoted in verse 44. Admittedly, we're not sure if verse 44 in Matthew 21 should be here or not. If you read a footnote, you'll see that it's in some manuscripts and not others. Our translators have included it, but it's not certain that it should be there. In any case, it refers to a different passage in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 2, where the different kingdoms of this world are represented by the different parts of the image that Nebuchadnezzar sees in his dream. And then a stone comes and crushes them all, becomes a great mountain. And Jesus is, of course, that stone again. So these various passages in the Old Testament referring to a stone are all applied in the New Testament to Christ as a stone over which some will stumble and find it a stone of offense and not come to believe, but for others it will be precious. They will believe and they will not be put to shame. Finally, verses 45 to 46, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them, and although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because the crowds held him to be a prophet. They don't change, do they? They were afraid of the people before, and that's why they couldn't say that John the Baptist was from men, and they're afraid here too, and yet they're still rejecting God's message. They take the parable to be spoken against them, and in a sense it is. But we should also remember that when prophets denounce people, it's not simply to announce judgment that's coming on them, it's also to give them an opportunity to repent. And if these chief priests and scribes had been open to the word of God, they would have seen this as a warning that they ought to respond to. But they don't. It is interesting, and instead they get angry and want to kill Jesus. Now, this is on a different level entirely, but I think it's a point worth making. You can tell an awful lot about a person by the way they respond to rebuke. Unfortunately, you can tell a lot about me. Maybe this applies to all of us. You can tell a lot about a person by the way they respond to rebuke. Proverbs has a good deal to say about this. Rebuke a wise person and they'll just get wiser. Rebuke a fool and you're going to pay for it because the fool will not respond to it. Psalm 141 puts it in a wonderful way. Let the righteous person strike me. It is a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It is oil for my head. Let not my head refuse it. Godly people, when they are corrected, when they are rebuked, see it as an opportunity to become wiser, to become more like the people they ought to be. And even if they think the rebuke is misplaced and out of order, they realize still that they've got a long way to go, and so they can respond humbly to correction, to rebuke. And it's a sign of godliness when we can accept correction, when we can accept rebuke, when we can see it as an opportunity to become more the people that we ought to be. It's a sign of our self-absorption and self-centeredness. Whenever anybody attempts to correct us, we get angry or we get dismissive. And that's the way these chief priests and scribes. Now, it's an entirely different level. This is the Son of God to whom they're responding, but the principle holds true. Godly people respond positively and become wiser, become godlier when people rebuke them or correct them. The self-absorbed, the self-centered become defensive or become angry, as these people did. Two other points worth making, and we'll conclude for the evening. There are those in the church, as these chief priests and elders, who are given responsibility, and once given responsibility, forget that they have been given responsibility and given authority because they are under authority. And whatever responsibility they are given, they start to assume it is their fiefdom. They can do with it as they please. And they've been given authority and they like to exercise their authority. The kind of thing that Jesus says, that's what happens among the rulers of the Gentiles. But rulership among you is to be marked by servant spirit. And yet, just as these chief priests and elders misused their authority, took it as given to them and inherit to them, they can do with it as they please, so there are those within the church given responsibility who refuse to use it in a servant spirit for the edifying of others, and instead take it as their fiefdom, their opportunity to exercise power. Don't anybody get in my way. I've got power, I've got authority, and you never want to run into a customs officer who's feeling their authority. Anyway, that can apply within the church, as it did here to the chief priests and the elders of the people. Finally, the stone which was rejected by the builders has become the headstone of the cornerstone of the temple of God. And it's easy to think of that as a simple two-stage process. Rejection followed by exaltation. But it's not that simple, because Jesus was rejected and is rejected. By most of the world today, he is still rejected. And Jesus was exalted, so his period of exaltation overlaps with a continuing period of rejection. He is exalted, but that exaltation is only perceived by those with faith, right? The day will come when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. But for the time being, it's not simply that Jesus was rejected and is now exalted, but he was rejected and is rejected. He was exalted and is perceived as exalted by God's people, but his full exaltation is still in the future. So we're living in an in-between time, or an overlapping time, when Jesus is still rejected. We believe in his exaltation. We believe that as we serve him and suffer with him, we will one day share in his exaltation and in his glory as well. But for the time being, we need to share in his suffering as he suffered, because it is still a period of rejection by most of the world. And so Hebrews 13 tells us the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as a sacrifice for sins are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Jesus was rejected and is now exalted, but the world still rejects him. And if we're going to be faithful to him, we can expect in this age to have to endure his reproach, to have to be scorned as he was scorned, to bear suffering with him before we can enter into his glory as he already is. God give us the strength to be his faithful people in this time of trial, so that we may one day share in his glory. Amen.